Alright, hello and welcome to round 6 of the Menorca Open. You may be wondering what happened to round 5, and so am I. This is one of the few tournaments I play in that I don't have the games recorded, like on a GGT board in all or most rounds. And so, while I currently have, 8 score sheets with me over here, this is a 9-round event, and the round 5 one seems to be mysteriously missing. So I guess I'll give a quick summary because I don't have the exact game in my hand right now. Hopefully I'll find it later. But roughly speaking, what happened is we played a very, very strong AM, a little bit stronger than myself. And so I had prepared the Scotch Gambit for this game because I thought it would be an interesting try. I haven't played it in many, many, many years. But after bishop e5, I had spent a long time preparing the main move knight e4. Now after knight takes d4, black has two main moves, bishop d7 or bishop c5, both of which are quite interesting. And so I had some very deep ideas here, especially because my opponent did have a game or two in these lines where I think that's like a slight inaccuracy somewhere much deeper down the line, so I wanted to try to exploit that. But what I did not look at all was this sort of modern main line that people have been trying a lot more recently, which is this very odd-looking move, knight d7, which seems very, very passive and makes it very, very difficult to defend this pawn on c6. But the point is that after takes, knight takes d4, black is going to defend this pawn in a very unusual manner with the move knight b8. And despite the fact that black has spent, 3 moves in the opening transferring his knight from g8 to b8, turns out that black is actually doing quite well here. Black has the two bishops, black has a very, very solid center, and, shouldn't really have any problems. This position is pretty much equal. Black scores very well. And so, faced with this, which I hadn't looked at in a very, very long time, I wasn't quite sure what the white's plan was supposed to be. I decided to play slower with castles, bishop e7, rook e1, castle, bishop f4, just defending the pawn and waiting basically for the knight to move before we take on c6 so that it can't go to b8 and naturally defend the pawn. What I missed is apparently a very famous opening trap here that was probably well known to my opponent but not to me, which is that after knight c5, take on c6. This is the whole idea, is waiting for knight c5, so now after takes on d4. We put pressure on the c6 pawn, which is kind of annoying for black to have to contend with immediately. After bishop d7 or something, black's pieces are very passive, and after something like bishop g3, intending f4, f5, it's an interesting position. But after bishop takes c6, black does not have to take back immediately. Because of this sort of unfortunate placement of the bishop, black has the additional option of playing knight to e6 first, also defending the d4 pawn a little bit, and also attacking this very important dark square bishop. We have to slide back, and after takes, c5, black is immediately taking full control of the center, has liquidated the bad knight, and is already very, very close to winning, which we almost recovered from, actually. We managed to outplay our opponent pretty heavily from here and crawled back to a playable position, but eventually the advantage out of the opening was just too much, and unfortunately we lost the game. If I do find the notation, obviously we'll go into it in more detail, but this was the interesting part anyway. The rest of it didn't really have a whole lot to discuss. Which set up this game that we had in round 6 against a low-rated player, also a FIDE master, but around 2200 FIDE. Obviously, sort of similar to game 4, this is the kind of game that you do want to win. It's not a disaster if you draw, but you do want to win, of course. But it's an opponent that is obviously strong enough to punish you if you do anything too crazy, so we do have to be still kind of responsible in the opening. And so what I prepared for this game against a player that I looked at some of his games, he stays very, very solid. Pretty much plays d4, c4, knight c3, knight f3 in some order every game. Bishop f4, e3, just very classical Queen's Gambit setup. No weaknesses in the position, no complications allowed. Draws a lot of games, of course, because, it's not a very serious try for an advantage. But especially against a higher rated player, I was expecting him to do pretty much the same thing. Just, play very, very, very unambitiously with white, try to stay solid, and wait for me to do something to either overpress or just try to force a draw as quickly as possible. So my solution to this problem, I guess this is sort of a common problem, and one that I spent a lot of time before the tournament, not specifically for this opponent, but for this type of opponent. There's a lot of 2200s in the world that are very, very content just forcing a draw with white out of the opening, even, not playing that high up, even just 100, 150 points up. And so it's usually fine to allow that, if they're not going to take any advantage of the white pieces, like, sure, are we really that upset about making an easy draw, only playing 100, 150 points down? But we do want to win some of those games. We probably need to win, 20% of the time or something to maintain our sort of rating expectation. And so we do need to at least have the option of entering more complicated positions. And so what I prepared a lot of stuff in general for this sort of situation, but for this specific game, I decided to take a friend's recommendation and go for a kind of King's Indian defense kind of structure. Particularly because I didn't expect my opponent to go for the, challenging main lines. I expected my opponent to play something much more solid, which is what he did do. And here, of course, white should play e4 if he wants a real advantage. Instead, my opponent went for knight f3, which is a very, very unambitious attempt. And just trying to stay very, very solid. This is what I expected. Again, what my opponent played d4, c4, knight c3, knight f3 against pretty much everything. So I was expecting him to do the same against the King's Indian, and I felt that, okay, if we can guarantee that these are where his pieces are going to be on move 4, King's Indian isn't that bad. That seems like a reasonable way to play the position in a way that keeps chances alive. So bishop g7, g3, again, by far the most solid option. White is not going to allow any of this, mutual opposite side attack stuff where in typical King's Indian fashion, black is hurling pieces down the king side, white is hurling pieces down the queen side, trying to break things up. And it's a question of who gets there first. g3 is a much more solid option. The bishop doesn't really make a lot of sense on g2. It doesn't really accomplish anything there because white will usually play e4. Well, it usually has already played e4, but usually we'll play it later, and then the bishop is just kind of staring at nothing for a very, very long time. But it's a very solid defensive piece here, and it means that black's typical counterplay with like e5 and f5 and f4 and so on comes with a lot less power. The trade-off, of course, is that, since white has committed a piece to a pretty bad square, the play on the queen side that white usually gets with like b4 and c5 and so on is also a lot less powerful. And so black should never really be in too much trouble, but it's not really clear what black's plan is either to try to generate any real play. So I wasn't surprised to see my opponent go for the very, very solid stuff, but my idea in this was obviously a little bit deeper. So bishop g2, knight d7, all of this is pretty well known. Castle. Now black has two ways to play the position. Black can play for c5, which leads to a sort of Menorca structure after like e4 takes. This is one way to play the position. This is a Menorca bind essentially out of the Sicilian where the bishop has committed to g2, which again is not a very good square for the bishop, but makes a little bit more sense here now that e5 is sometimes possible to open up the long diagonal. It also just defends the e4 pawn, which is important. But the more dynamic way to play the position is e5 in more typical King's Indian fashion, which is what we did in this game. My opponent played h3. This is slightly deep idea. I guess it's aimed at preventing knight g4 to e5 sometimes. Black probably is eventually going to take on d4 and then try to make use of the e5 square. So this is aimed partially at preventing the knight from going to e5 via g4. And this also sets up the advanced g4 from white himself, which is partially just grabbing space. It's partially also opening up a square for the knight to go to g3, which is a very natural position for it. It's also threatening g5, which will push this knight to a much more passive square. So it's just a very useful general move. So far, we're still very well within theory. Rook e8, e4. Now black needs to decide whether he's taking on d4 or not. Since we've already played rook e8, we are pretty committed to taking, so we have to. Takes, knight c5, rook e1, and now this is the idea that I wanted to try. Typically in this position, black plays either a5 or bishop d7, but there is this move that's been popular recently in somewhat high-level play, which is this very subtle-looking move h6. It has a couple points to it. I won't go into too much detail because this is a very deep opening idea that requires quite a lot of exploration to fully understand. But some of the surface level ideas, first of all, white would like to find a place to put the star square bishop, and the most natural place to put it by far is on f4. If it goes to f4 safely, it puts pressure on the d6 pawn, which means that black is not really able to play c6 as easily, which is a large part of black's plan, both to generate some counterplay with something like, a6 and b5, or to play d5, also to open the queen to go to b6, which is very important. So black would like to play c6 at some moment, and bishop f4 is a very concrete way of trying to take advantage of the weakness that will leave. c6 also is a little bit necessary to stop knight d5 sometimes, which would be another one of white's plans. So by playing h6, we at least open up the idea of if white plays bishop f4, we're going to play g5 and kick the bishop away. Another idea is that since we now control the g5 square, a knight can go there sometimes. For example, if white goes ahead and kicks this knight out of c5 now or later, then after knight e6, we maybe like bishop e3, or for example, defending the pawn. Black has the additional option that he wouldn't usually have without the pawn on h6 of renewing the pressure on e4 by putting the knight on g5. So this is the main idea of h6. It's also, of course, a waiting move. It forces white to commit to a little bit of a setup before we decide how it is that we're going to organize our pieces. And so all in all, it's the downside, of course, it is expending a tempo. It also is weakening the king side a little bit. If white does eventually get in like g4, f4, g5, it also opens up a hook on the king side for white to attack. So it's not all positives. But that's the general idea of this move, and this is what I wanted to try. Unbeknownst to me, this was kind of a failure of preparation. This did not come as a surprise to my opponent. Apparently, he did have a game he was telling me after, like a year or two ago, that I guess either didn't make it in the database or whatever database I was looking at, or I just missed it completely, one or the other. But my opponent actually had a game against this before, so he was well aware of the idea, and apparently had prepared a way to neutralize it, which we'll see shortly. My opponent here played b3. It's slightly inaccurate to do it immediately, I think. Most people play rook b1 first and then b3, but I don't think it's probably a big difference. This just is a little more committal. Rook b1 retains the option of playing b4 in one move, but it's not like this is losing. I did spend some time just to make sure, like checking if I can take on e4 or something. If there's any tactics along the long diagonal, maybe we take twice on e4 and play c5, for example. But it didn't look like anything serious, so I continued with the normal plan, just a5. Black is going to play a4 at some point and try to break down the queen side. Right now the king side is very, very stable, and white has control of the center, so that leaves really just the queen side as the place to play. My opponent now played rook b1. Typically, again, this position is reached by rook b1, a5, and then b3, but same difference. I played c6, and now white has to figure out a sort of plan. One point to playing b3 instead of leaving the pawn back on b2 is that white would like to expand on the queen side by playing a3 and b4. And if white just played, rook b1, a5, a3, then black has this very typical idea, a4, constricting the queen side entirely, and now this knight on c5 will be forever unassailable. This would be a big accomplishment for black. And so when white wants to play b4 or a3 and b4 against a5, they often have to take the extra move to play b3 before playing a3 and b4. So one plan in this position after rook b1, c6 is to play, a3 and b4 slowly. And that would be very, very natural. a3, queen b6, b4, for example, is one way of playing the position. Another is, since we played c6, we have weakened the d6 pawn, and so even though we've tried to prepare a little bit for bishop f4, it is still a move that is viable to play. If we do play g5 and kick the bishop back, yes, well, okay, I guess maybe all the way back to c1, for example, yes, we've kept the bishop out of f4, but this is also weakening. So white can try to take advantage of this by like f4, for example, next move, or h4 next move, trying to put some pressure on the king side. That's one way of playing. But probably the simplest way to diffuse this, which is what my opponent played, is just get out of the way of any, shenaniganry along this diagonal, any problems with queen b6. Just play king h2, pass a little bit, pass the onus back to black a little bit to make black commit to a setup, and try to figure out, okay, what exactly is it that you're going to be, doing here? One sort of main line that I knew was a thing was white playing bishop b2 here. This is the other point of b3, is that it opens up a square for the bishop to fee and shadow 2. Now, this does sort of call into question a little bit why the rook is on b1, but there are ideas here, for example, sending the bishop back to a1 to make this rook useful again, and then once again, a3, b4, and so on. Now, I thought that part of the point of playing bishop b2, and the reason why people do it immediately, rather than spend a move on king h2, is now the move a4 isn't really possible, because after b4 and knight e6, white can actually just go ahead and take this pawn. If the bishop were back on c1, this wouldn't be possible, because we can just take on d4, force the queen away, and then take this knight. But with the bishop on b2, this knight is defended a second time, and so there's no such issue anymore. So when my opponent played king h2, I wasn't familiar with this move, but I knew that bishop b2 was the main line. And so I figured that probably the reason that people play bishop b2 before playing king h2, which is a move that is played after bishop b2 a lot, probably, the reason that people don't start with this is because now a4 is possible. And so I decided to play it. In hindsight, maybe that was not true. Maybe I was sort of overthinking it. Maybe king h2 is just like kind of transposing, and I should have played any kind of simpler move here. I don't know, queen c7, bishop d7, whatever. Queen b6 maybe. Knight e6 immediately unprompted. I don't know. There's a lot of options for black to try to keep chances a little more alive. But I kind of overthought it, I guess, a little bit and went for a4 immediately, which allows white to kind of liquidate a little bit immediately. Or not liquidate, I guess, but resolve some of the tension immediately. My opponent played b4. I played knight e6. This much I was expecting. And now I was expecting to move bishop e3, which I was familiar with. I knew that this was all part of my preparation, kind of. Not quite with king h2, but this sort of general idea. And now after takes bishop e6, I was pretty comfortable playing this position. We do have some pressure on c4. Then I can come around for d7, either to e5 or b6 to put more pressure on c4. And white is going to have a little bit of a hard time holding the queen side together. Getting a pair of pieces off was a pretty serious accomplishment for black. Objectively, white is probably still slightly better, but I would be pretty happy to play out this position. My opponent instead came up with a very interesting idea that I did not think about at all when I played a4. I did spend, 10-15 minutes before I played a4, but I did not see this idea at all, which was to simply not allow the exchange and slide back with the knight to e2. At this point, I realized that strategically, black is always in big trouble strategically in these positions, because if white gets the opportunity to consolidate the position a little bit, black is going to be left completely without an idea. For example, if it's white to move in this position, after f4, just sort of taking control of some of the important squares for black's knights, g5 and e5, white is gaining a lot of space. White is playing f4, white is probably following up with g4, maybe knight g3. This pawn is completely unassailable. This pawn is very, very difficult to get to. And with all of the minor pieces on the board, there just aren't a lot of, they're all kind of competing for the same squares. Both the bishop and the knight would like to be on e6, for example. A lot of things would like to be on d7 and then e5 and whatnot. So even besides the fact that white is starting to build up a very serious attack, f4, g4, knight g3, f5, g5, whatever, a lot of stuff is coming. Even if that weren't the case, it's not really clear what black is doing in the meantime. It feels like, white is going to be playing with a free hand. And so black does need to do something immediately. This is why h6 is very, very risky. We are investing probably our only tempo. Black maybe gets like one tempo of leeway before he just starts getting completely run over. but we've used it now, so we do have to do something. And so if black doesn't do something in this position immediately, I felt that it was very, very close to lost, and so I needed to resolve things immediately. So I played knight g5. This is kind of the last opportunity to do it, because again, white will play f4 if we're not allowed to. And my opponent immediately blitzed out knight to d4. Whoops. My opponent immediately blitzed out knight back to d4, just defending, opening up the defense of the e4 pawn again. Now, again, I realized that, okay, we can't put more pressure on e4. That much is kind of stuck. The tension is resolved for now. And white's next move is going to be f4. So if we play a move like, you know, bishop d7, for example, white is going to play f4. The knight is going to come back to e6, and then white can again go back to e2. It's important to go to e2 because if we go to f3, then we can trade off a pair of pieces in a sort of fancy-looking way, and that helps resolve a lot of the tension. At this point, black is... I would be happy to play it. But knight e2 defends the knight, so we don't even have that option. And now, once again, we have a scenario where black's pieces are kind of tripping over each other. There's problem with d6, there's problem with g4, f5, h4, g5, like everything's kind of not really clear what our plan is in the interim. And so I spent a lot of time here because I understood, you know, my opponent is very clearly signaling that he's not interested in winning the game. He's just very, very happy to repeat. I wasn't 100% sure if, like, okay, maybe he's just doing that one time and he'll deviate the second time. So I did repeat once, just to make sure, but he immediately puts down knight d4 again. Now this is a clear draw offer, because if we go back, you know, we can play knight e6 and claim a draw if we want to. And I just could not find any other alternative here. You know, I spent a long time trying to make, like, stuff like queen d6 work. I spent a long time trying to make, like, I don't know, even, like, some sacrifices on h3 work, and so on, but eventually I decided that there just wasn't anything, and I was about to be in very, very big trouble. I was sort of advised after this game, like, okay, but taking a draw here is a little silly, you know, just play on in a bad position, like, whatever, it's a lower rated player. But I was kind of concerned, you know, normally I'm very happy to play a bad position, as, you know, regular viewers are probably quite aware, and generally have positions that look as bad as this all the time. But I felt that this was the type of bad position where it's very, very easy for white to play. The position kind of plays itself. It's not really clear what black's doing in the meantime. It's not really like... It's not like it's a bad position, but it's complicated. There are ways for white to go wrong. It's more like it's a bad position, and whatever white does is going to be strong. So eventually I decided, you know, even though I really didn't want to just go back to e6 and claim the draw. Afterwards, I checked with the engine a little bit, and apparently there is a way to continue the game, which I had overlooked, which is this sort of unusual looking move, queen d7. It's very weird to put the queen sort of in front of the bishop and blocking in its defense. But in this case, it's actually really quite difficult to hold this pawn immediately. I kind of initially rejected this because I didn't really see what the point was after something like g4, you know. We've just kind of made a one-move threat. Black has defended the threat in a move that he already wanted to make anyway, so what's the point? But I think the computer's idea here was that now if we play knight e6, knight e2, then white is a little bit less capable of playing f4, since the support of it is a little bit weakened, and we can play a move like g5, for example, to try to restrict it a little bit, and then, you know, a very slow plan like knight f7, knight f8, knight g6, trying to utilize the dark square starts to look pretty appealing. It starts to, you know, really ask why this bishop is on g2. I said it was poorly placed before, now it's extremely poorly placed. And this king on h2 actually also starts to feel a little bit uncomfortable, because after knight h7, bishop e5, it's sort of losing a tempo in a way where the bishop already wants to come to e5. So we're gaining, you know, whatever time we've lost playing h6, g5, whatever, we are sort of gaining back by harassing this king. So I completely overlooked this idea. This would have definitely kept the game going. I think, honestly, I really like the position after knight e6. Now that I look at it, it seems like exactly the sort of position that I would have enjoyed playing. So I really regretted taking the draw after I saw this idea. But to be honest, during the game, this did not occur to me, like, even in the slide. I saw the move briefly, queen d7, but after g4, I just didn't calculate any further. So I think this is probably this is a pretty serious area that I've consistently had trouble in. Um, there's a game that really stuck with me. This is not really related, but there's a game that really stuck with me in this sort of Moscow variation of the Najdorf at some point. Trying to remember exactly. I don't remember the exact move order or anything, but something along these lines, where after like castle e5 take, here whatever knight d2, something of this sort. There was a very interesting idea I saw after knight e5 g6, something like this. It might not have been this exact position. Probably wasn't. Actually, it was probably with like this or something. This is very powerful idea, queen d2, which wasn't played. Apparently, like I think the computer actually said this was like winning. Yeah, like if you check the engine here, like it gives queen d2 as a top move, and this was a very unintuitive move to me. I've shown this to some of my friends before, and you know, it probably wasn't its exact position because I remember it being even higher evaluation. But the idea is just okay. Yeah, sure, we're blocking in this bishop, but this bishop is perfectly fine here, and we just need to get the queen here. So if this bishop weren't here, it would be perfectly natural to play queen d2. I wouldn't think anything of it. But since this bishop is here, there's some sort of mental block of playing the move queen d2. And in the game that I saw this in, queen d2 wasn't played, and black went on to hold. But queen d2 would have like ended the game on the spot almost. But black would be basically just busted. So this is definitely like a sort of blind spot, a consistent blind spot for me. I'm not really sure why. Just something doesn't work in my brain to consider moves like this, like queen d2 here or queen d7 in this position with the bishop here. If the bishop were on e6, it would be very obvious. Yeah, we play queen d7, we put pressure here. Like, of course, it's a great square for the queen. But something about blocking the bishop seems to be a consistent blind spot for me. So I thought that was interesting. That was probably my only real takeaway from this game, to be honest. Obviously, it's a very short game without a whole lot to discuss. But that's my takeaway from that is that that's one of the patterns that I probably need to work on, and hopefully you find that interesting as well, because I've definitely found that to be a kind of consistent blind spot for people. A lot of people that I show this position, I showed the Sicilian position to, like, definitely don't really consider the move queen d2, even though it's extremely powerful. But that's pretty much it for this game. So with that, we moved to, I guess, 3.5 out of 6. Something like +1. Yeah, +1 score, so 3.5 out of 6. Which meant we'd probably still be playing down the next round, but we'd at least have the white pieces. And this kind of evened out the tournament again. We were having a pretty average event going into round 4, and then we got a complete gift in very strange fashion, as we saw in the previous video. Now we are back to basically average with this unfortunate draw. And so we have 3 rounds to kind of make something of not just the tournament, but the trip as a whole. As we saw, the last tournament was pretty bad. So I was hoping to take the opportunity in the last 3 rounds to at least score one good result in my international trip. And so I will see you next time for round 7, where we managed to at least get on the right track. See you next time.